Thank you for joining us all tonight for Ideas in Action with Alicia Garza and Chris Jackson. I'm Amity Pei. I'm Communications Director for Color of Change, the country's largest online racial justice organization. And I'm here to introduce tonight's event. We're partnering with One World tonight to make a virtual space for critical conversation between Editor-in-Chief of One World, Chris Jackson, and one of our most powerful organizers and visionaries, Alicia Garza. In 2014, Alicia wrote a Facebook post that changed the world and created a movement. It read, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter. Black lives matter." That movement continues today. And tonight, Alicia and Chris will discuss the importance of resistance and resilience and how they ground their work in a vision for collective humanity. At Color of Change, we believe that everyday people are powerful enough to end the practices that are unfairly holding Black people back and harming our country. And we champion solutions that move us all forward. In the last 2 weeks, we've helped 6.5 million people take action for racial justice in our country, and we're thrilled to be partnering today with One World for this important conversation. Without further ado, here is Chris Jackson, One World's Editor-in-Chief, to kick us off.
Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I can't imagine someone I'd rather be talking to tonight than Alicia Garza, one of our country's most powerful and influential activists, and someone who I think can speak particularly well to this moment. Before we start, I just wanted to thank Color of Change for working with us again on this project tonight, and to all the people at Penguin Random House who've been so active in getting this all organized. I'd also just like maybe for us to take a short moment of silence for the many tens of thousands of people who we've lost in this pandemic that we're undergoing, people who've been disproportionately Black, disproportionately brown, Native, disabled, elderly, and poor. And also for all of those that we've lost to racially motivated violence, particularly racially motivated violence in the name of the state. I'm just going to call out 3 names tonight: Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. So I hope you'll just join me for a short moment of silence to begin. And now I'd like to invite to our virtual stage, Alicia Garza.
Hey.
Hey, so good to see you, Alicia.
Really good to see you, and it's good to be seen.
Yes. So I wanted to start our conversation out by going back a little bit. I think of moments like this as being, for a lot of people, obviously very upsetting and jarring to us, but also I think for a lot of people, moments of awakening. And I think about, just in my own life, growing up in New York, in Harlem in the 70s and 80s, how my own political consciousness probably developed most rapidly around some of the most traumatic moments of that coming of age. And normally having to do with proximity to death. I mean, there were so many people who were murdered during that period in my neighborhood, but also so many people who we lost to police violence. And those were the first times I was out on the street, was to protest those deaths. And can you tell us a little bit about, I know obviously we've worked on this book together for some time now, and so I know so much about your own story, but I think one of the interesting things is that you've always been someone who's been driven toward activism, practically from childhood, but there were these inflection points, like the murder of Oscar Grant in Oakland, that really drove and sort of accelerated your kind of commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, I actually came up in the reproductive justice movement and got really politicized around the idea that young people, right, couldn't make good decisions about what to do with our bodies. This was a time when, Bush #1 and others were really pushing this narrative in this country around not only like a focus on the family narrative, but it was very much about kind of controlling women's bodies. And for me, you know, my mother had me, and she didn't expect to have me alone. And the thing that gave her options is that she had them. And so she used to talk to me coming up as a young kid, and she would tell me, you know, sex makes babies and babies are expensive. I didn't get any of the birds and bees talk. I didn't get any of that. And it's really when I was in college, though, to be frank, that I got politicized around racial justice. And, you know, at that time, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a lot happening in terms of the aftermath of uprisings that had shaped our entire country. You know, we all watched as Rodney King was brutally beaten on video cameras, which were not actually popular at that time. And then, of course, if you fast forward to Oscar Grant in my community, which was just a few blocks from my home. And I remember coming home after a New Year's celebration and turning on the television after midnight and seeing that just 3 blocks from my house, Oscar Grant had been shot in front of a train full of observers. And it just so happened that a young person who was interning at an organization that I worked at was one of the people who caught the entire thing on camera. And it actually became a part of the movie Fruitvale Station. And so, you know, there are these inflection points, you're right, where we start to understand that our lives are bigger than us, but we also understand that our lives are being shaped by people other than us. And we have an opportunity to decide if we think that that's right, if we think that that's fair, if we think that the ways that our lives are being shaped lead us towards wellness and dignity, humanity and wholeness, or whether the way that our lives are being shaped are leading us towards punishment and criminalization and injustice. And at each one of those inflection points, we get to make a choice about who we're going to be. And for me, at a very young age, at 12 years old, I decided I'm going to be somebody who not only tells different stories about what young people are doing. No, teenagers are not running around having sex like crazy, but there are those of us who are in intimate relationships who are trying to figure out what's best for us, and we're being denied the information and the resources that we need to make decisions that work for us. We're being denied the access that we deserve to desire and pleasure and intimacy by somebody who, frankly, has a whole different agenda about our bodies and our lives. Do we think that that's right, or do we think that it's wrong? And if we think that it's wrong, what are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. For me, I got politicized and got active in the movement. For others, people might shake their head and say, wow, it's really a shame that some people don't have access to what they need, and they move on with their lives. But then, of course, we come into moments like this where you can't move on with your life. Your everyday normal is interrupted by people who have decided to take action. And even in those moments, you get to make a choice about who you're going to be and what you're going to contribute.
That's really interesting. And you know, part of what I think is that a question that's kind of come to me, particularly in this moment, and listening to your story and thinking about your story as I've been doing for some time now, and thinking about my own life, is that, you know, we seem to go in these moments when there are these eruptions, you know, of visible movement activity, right? And, you know, you talked about like what happened with Oscar Grant in the Bay Area. Of course, you know, Black Lives Matter, which formed around a series of events going back to Trayvon Martin and Ferguson and so forth. And now here we are again. Are we just going in a loop, or do you feel like with each one of these things, we're getting closer to something?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Chris. And I can say in writing the book, I was like, are we going in a loop or are we moving forward? Right. And I will say that honestly, the way that I think about and look at history and look at the present and the connection between the two is that we're not going in circles per se, where we end up right where we began. If anything, I would imagine it like a spiral, right? Where you're moving in a circle, you're coming back, but you're not coming back to the place that you started from. You're actually in a new place, and you can look at where you started and assess the gap in between. And, you know, no, things are not the same now than they.
Mm.
To assess our strategies and that require us to frankly keep pushing forward. I know there's a lot. Black Lives Matter, people were saying all lives matter. And that was the.
Sorry, can you hang on 1 second, Alicia? Alicia, can you hear me? Just 1 second, can you hold on? We're having a little bit of a technical difficulty with your, can you just repeat that last thing you said again?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure, totally. So I was just saying that, you know, in 2013 and 2014, we were pariahs in terms of politics. People would say, we would say Black Lives Matter, and people would say all lives matter. And that was the most common response. We were not seen as a legitimate political force. We weren't seen as a movement. We were seen as, you know, people who were radicals. And even in our own communities, right? We were seen as people, for example, who were trying to move a gay agenda and interrupt a Black agenda, right? There's lots of ways in which we're in such a different place than we were then.
Well, what do you think? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say,
sorry.
I know, like, what there is still work to be done. I don't want to paint a rosy picture here. I mean, frankly, we are still watching the extrajudicial murders of Black people on television because we capture them on cell phone cameras. And it is only when there is an outcry that there is any semblance of political will to address it. We are going in a circular pattern in relationship to how we conceive of how we solve this problem once and for all. I do worry that just like in 2014, where we got body cameras as a result of, you know, protests that Ferguson leaders led in relationship to the murder of Mike Brown, maybe today what we get is better training or, you know, nicer police. But fundamentally, there's still a big challenge that we're facing, which is, you know, what do we do about the role of law enforcement in our communities? Is it enough to have better training or to restrict their practices? Or do we actually need to narrow the focus and the role of law enforcement in the first place? And it's an important conversation for America to have right now. For some, it's an uncomfortable one, but I can say, you know, 7 years ago, Black Lives Matter made people uncomfortable, and being uncomfortable is actually good for this country. People were uncomfortable when Black people were fighting for the right to be enfranchised. People were uncomfortable when women were fighting for the right to be enfranchised. And look where we've come, right? Now, it's not uncomfortable to believe that women should have the right to vote. It's not uncomfortable for us to believe that Black people should have the right to vote. Does it mean that those rights aren't still under attack? Absolutely not. But it means that we are in a different place because we have those rights and we're defending them, as opposed to needing to create those rights. And so, yeah, history is not circular in that way. It is a spiral, and I believe really deeply and profoundly that we're closer than we've been before, and that gives me hope.
Well, that is actually an encouraging thought. You know, you have this thing in the book where you talk about, you reference a lot, this theory from Gramsci about, you know, changing common sense, like that being the core of a revolution is when you change the common sense, the basic premise, you know, that society operates from, and then you can grow something new. And, you know, I was reading today about the Minneapolis Police Department or the city council in Minneapolis, talking about literally, you know, like eliminating the police and rebuilding something in its place, which was unimaginable that a major city would be talking about that. Does that kind of thing give you a, you know, a sense of, you know, possibility of what might come?
Absolutely. I mean, I woke up and I saw that article. It was the first thing I read when I opened my eyes this morning. And all I keep saying to myself is, what a time to be alive, right? The fact that the Minneapolis City Council is not only considering redistributing funds so that we don't address needs that communities have with police who aren't equipped to address those needs is incredible. And it's a conversation that organizers and advocates have been pushing for the better part of 20 years. So I can tell you, what a time to be alive. I can also say I keep seeing things like, the school district in Minneapolis saying that they are ending their contracts with police, and what that means for a decade of having police in schools, and now to say we're not going to do that is very, very powerful. Similarly in Los Angeles, right? They're moving some of the same proposals. And so, we should remember that when we see things like this, it is the result of organizing. It is the result of the pressure that protest builds on people to have the political will and the courage to examine new ways of operating. And that is fundamentally what movements can accomplish. And we shouldn't expect that every movement has a strategy on a blueprint that they can hand to you and you can plug into. So much of what movements do is respond to changing conditions, takes the pulse of what communities long for, but also what communities are scared of, right? Mm-hmm. And push the envelope to get closer to what it is that we deserve. So we're watching this in real time, and it's fundamentally incredible. And we must give most credit to the badass organizers in that city who have really helped to create the conditions to make this happen, and then have engaged us to work with them to help amplify it. That's just really a blessing.
And so that's a lot of, I think, I feel like you have to offer, particularly in your book, but also in the model of your life, is this question of how do you, the original title for your book, I think, was something like How a Hashtag Became a Movement. But how is it that you can take something from the point of being like, this sort of germ of an idea, as it was in 2014, and of course, like you said, 20 years before that, when people have been working toward this kind of reform, how do you keep the pressure on? How do you build it from being just like a kind of moment to being a movement?
Well, there is a science and an art. And, from the time when Patrice and Opal and I created the Black Lives Matter network, right, which started from a series of social media platforms and grew into a network with chapters all over the world, we didn't have a roadmap. We really relied on instinct, and we relied on relationships. And we paid attention to what was going on and moving in the world. And I hope that doesn't feel or sound amorphous, but that's literally the secret sauce, is who you're in relationship to, what they're working on and what you're working on. Also, frankly, what time it is in the country, right? And your willingness to keep pushing things forward. We tried so many things. We, held conference calls, national conference calls for people to talk about issues that were of interest for that moment. Our first gathering, frankly, was a conference call that we pulled together after the killer of Renisha McBride was convicted of murder. We all know that in cases of vigilante murder and also in cases of police murder, that oftentimes the aggressors are not held accountable. And in this particular case, Ted Wafer was held accountable, and he currently sits in jail. That was a victory that was the result of organizing. And Dream is going to be mad at me for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyways. Dream Hampton is not only a badass writer, but she's also an organizer. And, she worked with people in Michigan to make sure that that Renisha McBride's death would not go unaccounted for. And after that, we held a conversation because, frankly, so many of us believe that justice comes from people going to jail. And while that might make us feel better, right, make us feel like they're feeling what we're feeling, the fact of the matter is prisons and jails are terrible places to be. Prisons and jails do not rehabilitate people. They do not bring lives back. They do not address harm. And so we held a national conference call as Black Lives Matter about whether or not Ted Wafer being convicted was justice. And we had people on all different sides of the spectrum giving their feedback and input. And those were the types of spaces that we really tried to create. And from that, right, I think we started to build a reputation of creating spaces for people to connect, not only online, but then moving into 2014 when Mike Brown was killed, Patrice and Darnell had a great idea to organize a freedom ride to Ferguson. Another way for people to connect directly to what is happening on the ground. Not only was it intended for people to be able to connect and offer support, but there was also a strategic aspect to it. Mm-hmm. Frankly, one of the things that we heard a lot was that mainstream media was telling their own story of what was happening in Ferguson. They were telling stories of looters and rioters, right? And unrest. And all of the images that you would see on TV were of tanks and rubber bullets and tear gas. So we organized Black media to go to Ferguson and to be able to tell that story from a Black perspective, which made a difference in terms of how the story began to be told from that point forward. And I think that without getting too far into the Ferguson conversation, because Ferguson leaders need to tell that story. So I'm winking and nodding at you, Chris, that that might be the next book for One World. But I will say that, you know, we left Ferguson and didn't think we were going to go back. But the people who came said, we want to keep organizing. And they actually forced us to form chapters. We were like, we're not prepared for this, right? And they were like, but we are. And so you all have already run your mouth, right? You've created this umbrella, so let's go. And so I just walk that story out to say that there's no recipe here. It's really about instinct. It's about network. It's about timing. And frankly, it's about being able to move when you just know it's right.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I think is so beautiful about the way that you talk about movements and activism is that, in the book, and this is not to plug the book again, but in the book you do talk about this, this is how, for you, activism was fundamentally a way to connect to other people, which I thought was like a beautiful way to kind of begin the story. It's not about like some big abstract, sort of political goal necessarily. It's about this is how we connect. And we can start to share a vision for a world that we want to bring into being. And that connection can't just happen online, although we're obviously doing a lot of connecting online right now. But what's interesting is that it's not online that the movement is happening now. Even under the the cloud of this pandemic, people feel like they need to go in the streets and see each other and be with each other and march together. What is the sort of special sauce, of connection? That includes things, like you've done in your life, like, knock on doors, go in people's homes, like touch them, like hear them, sit with them, listen to them. Like, how does that, make a big difference as opposed to just, which is not to dismiss what we can do online or what we can do through social media, but what is that human component? Why is that so important?
Everybody longs for connection. That is what makes us human, literally. We can't live in isolation. And in fact, when we put people in isolation, you actually see folks deteriorate. When you hear stories of people who are in solitary confinement, they tell you that literally they start to deteriorate because we as human beings depend on connection to survive. It is how we read the world. It's how we read one another. And, making sense of this moment, organizing is fundamentally rooted in connection. And when I was being trained as an organizer, I was always told that organizing wasn't about getting somebody to get involved in your campaign. It wasn't about, getting somebody to use your slogan. It was fundamentally about relationships, and everything moves at the speed of relationships. I'll give you an example. I mean, when I was coming up in organizing, the only way I could get people to do something that was outside of their comfort zone was to spend many hours on their front porch, at their kids' recitals, meeting their friends at their kitchen table while they were making dinner after a long day of work. People need to know that they can trust you. And frankly, when we look at all great movements throughout history, we notice a similar response. When we look at the last period of civil rights, people moved at the speed of relationships. And that was both for connection, but it was also for safety, right? In certain environments, if people didn't know who your people were, they didn't mess with you, right? and I can tell you my Southern relatives are still the same way. Folk are like, yeah, but who are your people? Like, where do you come from, right? And it's a way for us to make sense of who you are, but also what your motives are. And I think moving into this moment, I think you saw people rush out of their homes in the midst of a global pandemic, because being isolated in your house while you're watching on television somebody who looks like you being brutally murdered, while the officer looks into the camera while he's doing it, it makes you feel so incredibly alone and fearful and hopeless. And so why people pour into the streets is to be connected to the energy of other people who are sharing a similar experience. Every one of us who has experienced injustice in the world wonders if it's only us or if other people have had that experience too. And movements fundamentally bring together people who long for not feeling gaslit around the experiences that they have every day that they know are wrong, but they can't quite place why or who's responsible. And movements also give us an opportunity, a way to challenge and channel the anger, the isolation, the fear, and the rage into something productive. Sometimes it becomes, a law or a policy. Other times it becomes an ecosystem of organizations that are fighting back against the injustices and ways in which our communities are disenfranchised. So when you look at, organizations like the Movement for Black Lives, you'll see, right, that this is a beautiful, rich ecosystem of Black organizations that are working together and independently to impact the lives of Black people. And in that coalition, we suddenly, again, feel less alone, less helpless, and we feel more powerful. When we feel powerful, we take risks that we wouldn't necessarily take alone. But the very nucleus of being able to go from, why is this happening to me, to I'm willing to be somebody who changes it, fundamentally requires connection and relationship.
That's so interesting. And it feels so true. I was out at a march yesterday and sort of watching what's going on, from a distance is very different than being in the middle of it. And feeling that energy, even the people who would, hang out over their stoops and playing their pots, you just feel a sense like you're not alone. And I think that is the beginning of, that sense of, as you said, feeling like, well, there's some real power in this. It's not just my feeling, it's a feeling that's networked out, and that if we can do something with this feeling, it's powerful. And I guess that brings me to my next question is, how do we do something with that feeling? How do we, first of all, just going back to your Anisha McBride story, you all had to consider well, what does justice look like in this case? What does accountability look like right now for the people who were obviously immediately responsible for these deaths? And we've seen in some of these cases, that hasn't even happened, that first level of accountability hasn't happened. But in a larger sense, the larger sort of structures that we need to make accountable for this. How do we go from this moment to that level, to that reckoning with the people who have the power?
Yeah, I'm going to give a deeply unsatisfying answer, which is stay in the fight. We are in this moment where we have so much anguish, right, that we want the pain to stop now. And the fact of the matter is, these systems that we're fighting are as old as this country, and they will take a while to undo. There's times when we can speed up the progress of that project. And there are times when the progress of that project really requires a methodical approach to changing what is possible politically. And you need to be able to do that in a range of ways. I could sit here right now and tell you, you know, there's policies that we can enact right now that will stop police from being able to use chokeholds or make it illegal for police to, you know, put their knee on somebody's neck as a way to restrain them. I could tell you that there's things that we can do to train police to be nicer police. But I wouldn't be being honest with you if I didn't say that many places already have those policies in place, but they have no one to enforce them. And, you know, we get again into this cyclical pattern of what I think is sometimes trying to find the shortest distance between A to B, rather than, or in addition to, let me say, because I don't think they're in contradiction. We should do stuff now to stop the bleeding, for sure. But if I'm trying to stop the bleeding and I've also broken several bones, I can put a cast on, but it doesn't mean that the bone has it doesn't mean that the bone has healed, and it's going to take a while for the bone to heal. And I might need to take a different approach, right, for the bone to heal versus dealing with the cut on my finger. So in this case, when it comes to policing, I just have to be honest, like the reason that things are so bad in policing is because we ask police to do things that they shouldn't be doing. We are asking police to be domestic violence counselors. We're asking police to be therapists. We're asking police to deal with people who are in crisis in terms of their mental health. And police are not trained to do that. And in fact, sure, we could spend a bunch of time training people with badges and guns to be able to respond differently to that, and maybe we should. But we also have people whose actual profession it is to do that work. And the reason that we don't have enough of those people in our community is not because we don't have enough trained people. It's actually because we have had government that has whittled away that safety net. We've had government that has whittled away that infrastructure in our communities, and they've replaced it, right, with control and surveillance. Which actually ends up exacerbating the problem. And so if you actually limit what police do in our communities and how often they come into contact with our people and for what, that is actually the key to saving more lives, as long as you also invest on the other side in making sure that there is a robust set of resources that people can access, that they won't be criminalized for accessing, but also where you don't have the option for a mistake of trying to deal with a mental health crisis and you shoot someone, right? Therapists don't carry guns, right? They have other tools that they use. And so we need to make sure that that infrastructure is really robust in our communities. We need to make sure that, you know, if we could be calling police for, you know, things like petty shoplifting, or we could also be dealing with what's underneath that, which is that somebody doesn't have what they need. And so, you know, for me, when I hear people go, well, we can't just like get rid of police. I'm like, sure. I get where you're struggling, and there's places where I struggle around this too. But I want change as much as you do. And I want us to believe that we deserve better than tinkering. You know, we did body cameras, right? We've done commissions and task forces and blue ribbon panels. Right. And at the end of the day, we have the answers, but do we have the courage, right? Do we have the courage to say, actually, we're going to restore the role of government in our communities? We're going to enfranchise communities to be a part of the solution. And we are also going to limit the ways in which we punish people for not having the things that they need, because we've created a society where not everybody can have the things they need to live well. So yeah, that's what I think we can be doing in this moment.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things that's been popping up, you know, in the news over the last few days, as people are starting to really think about, like, well, what are the police? You know, like, I think it's odd because we've obviously had police for, you know, ever. And yet now for the first time, I think people are starting to wonder, what what is this institution? And they're also starting to look at the budgets for police, and they're astonishing. Like billion-dollar budgets, you know, in Los Angeles and New York. Even in a place like Minneapolis, they have enormous millions and millions of dollars devoted to policing that the white population barely interacts with, right?
Correct.
So it makes you wonder, what are we paying for if perhaps like an occupying army in certain neighborhoods? I just want to like quickly just say that we're going to do a Q&A in a minute. So if you have questions, there's a Q&A button down there and you can ask them. But I wanted to just going back to Alicia, I feel like you were talking a lot about what we, or sometimes you used the second person, you said you can do about some of these things. And that brings me to this question of, because we're also, obviously, it's hard to remember everything that's happening in 2020 for us because there's so much. But we have an election coming up in 2020. And, you know, I was reading an op-ed that Stacey Abrams wrote in the Times this morning where she started saying, voting feels inadequate in our darkest moments, and ended it by saying, voting will not save us from harm, but silence will surely damn us all. What role do you think electoral politics has in the matrix of what it will take to get to that point of accountability?
You know, I am somebody who believes that electoral politics is harm reduction. And I came up as an organizer really hating politics and hating elections and feeling like, you know, all of this stuff is deeply rigged and not for us. And I've come to think about it differently, mostly because I've had people older than me, wiser than me, who have kind of tweaked my ear and been like, hey, check this out. Actually, elections do matter. And, you know, I believe that elections help us choose the terrain that we want to fight on, and they help us choose the people that we want to fight. And I never expect that a candidate that I support, in very few cases, is a candidate that I support, somebody who I want to have over for dinner, right? Or like build a deep relationship with. But I do need them to do things for me and for my community. And I believe that the process, right, of making elected officials accountable to the people that they represent is fundamentally important for the future of this democracy. And that's why I spend my time these days, at least this was true 2 weeks ago, I spend the majority of my time thinking about how to make Black communities powerful in politics through my work at the Black Futures Lab and the Black to the Future Action Fund. We have spent a lot of time over the last 2 years listening deeply to Black communities across the nation. We did the largest survey of Black people in America in 155 years, literally since slavery was abolished in this country. And we spent our time listening to the experiences that Black people are having in the economy, in our democracy, and in our society, and really getting ourselves clearer about what are the needs that need to be addressed from the mouths of our own people, and how do we translate that into a fight for power in the electoral arena. Because the fact of the matter is Black people want what everybody wants, right? We want safety, we want dignity, we want to be treated as fully human, and we want to have our needs met. And there are so many Americans who want the same thing, and for various reasons can't access that. But in order for us to be the kind of force that changes the balance of power in this country, we have to be able to see ourselves as connected. And elections and electoral politics is one way that we can do that. I also know that, you know, when it comes to elections and Black communities, so often we are used as symbol rather than substance. And, you know, whether it's, you know, politicians showing up on our doorsteps in October when the election is in November, whether it's, you know, the concerts that we get rather than the town halls that are discussing policies to change the rules that are rigged in our communities, whether it's the plates of fried chicken that mysteriously show up every time Black folks need to get engaged. There's all of these ways in which, frankly, racism is deeply entrenched in our electoral system as well. And so our work with the lab and the Action Fund is really not just centered around collecting data, but using that data in the service of building power. For example, Chris, we have a program that we're running called Black to the Ballot, where we essentially created a Black agenda for 2020 from the results of the largest survey of Black people in America. And these are the things that across gender, across income, across ideology, that Black people across the nation can agree on in terms of solutions. And we're using that to motivate our communities to register to vote and to turn out. And we have a hunch, right, that if we don't focus it so much on candidates, but instead focus on what we need and forcing candidates to address the things that we need, that maybe, right, maybe participation will be greater and larger and more robust because we're united around not just like talking points like rebuild the middle class or lift every voice or whatever nonsense people throw out today. And yes, I said it. But instead, we're united around the rules that we want shifted and how we want to change those rules. And we have a way to determine who's with us and who's against us. If the people who we elect don't choose to move our agenda forward, then we find elected officials who will, or we become them ourselves. So that's the way that I look at politics, and that's how I look at electoral organizing.
I think that's such an important point. And I think this is one of the things that excites me, again, about your work and about your book, as it describes that work, is it talks about politics as, first, as I said, a form of connection, between people, which I think is inarguably something that we all want. As you said, it's kind of fundamental to our species, the desire to connect with other people. But it's also work that can be joyful and creative and imaginative, right? Like work about thinking about new worlds. And I think that one of the reasons why people sometimes turn away from politics is that they feel like it's just the grim work of reinforcing the status quo.
That's right.
And I think, again, these moments of awakening are potentially moments when you can fill, that gap with imagination and say, well, this is what we can be. I love the idea of this, of getting people to say, like, what are the things that are important to them? And you can actually use your vote to get closer, not just to like forestalling disaster, which is also part of it, but it's also to kind of start to bring into being the world that you want. Do you think that, we need to get a different group of people like actually into like running for office and at that level, not just voting, but really being involved in the electoral system in that way?
100%. I've been so energized by some of the folks that we have elected who really engage in politics in a very transformative way. Whether it's, AOC, or whether it's our sister Ayanna Pressley, or whether it's people like Elizabeth Warren, right, who probably never saw themselves as somebody who would be a senator, but who worked to make inequality go away and realized, right, that there are people who are defending rigged rules every single day. Right. And we can throw rocks at the castle as much as we want, or we can invade it. People like Rashida Tlaib, people like my Congresswoman, Barbara Lee, who's been in politics for, I don't want to age her like that, but forever, right? And got her start, actually. She was mentored by Shirley Chisholm, who everybody knows says, bring your folding chair to the table. So I just, I don't want people to take away from this that the only path to power is to become an elected official. Not all of us are cut out for every role, but I do think it's important that if we want to change the way that democracy functions, that we actually put people in that democracy that can model what that looks like, that can model accountable leadership with integrity, that can model what it means to have a radical vision, but also know how to get things done. And I think we need many more AOCs, many more Presleys, right? We need many more squads. We need many more Ilhans. We need many more people who are not afraid to say, the way that this country is set up is rigged, And we have the power to change the rules, but do we have the courage and do we have the will? And then they show us how to do that, right? So I think that I've been asked a million times to run. I don't think that's really my jam. I think I'm better in this role. But, you know, I also encourage people to run, and I help to groom people on how to run. And I believe that our people can be powerful inside of Congress and city halls across the nation. And I also think that our people can be powerful in our communities, and those aren't mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful thought, that's what politics could potentially be. I have one more question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to bring some questions from our audience. We have quite a few flowing in. So one of the things that I think is really special about, I think, your vision, as you've sort of laid it out here, is that, you know, there's a kind of discipline of inclusiveness that I find in the way that you talk about movements and talk about political change. You talk a lot about the necessity of multiracial movements, but you also talk about how at the heart of them, all these movements, there needs to be a particular concern for Black liberation, as well as there being groups that are wholly devoted, you know, to Black liberation, where Black people can kind of work together for that purpose, but also places where we can all come together. And of course, you know, working as you have with the Domestic Workers Alliance for so long, that's a true multiracial group that has come together to create real change for some of the most vulnerable workers in the country, immigrants and Black people, and from, you know, all over the world. And so I'm just curious what you would say about, like, both that sort of tension between needing multi-racial movements, also centering the need for Black liberation, and why it is that you think that those two things can go together.
That's such a good question. And it gives me the opportunity to talk about my squad at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. But let me start off just by saying that, you know, if we understand anti-Blackness as the fulcrum around which white supremacy operates, then we have a better understanding of why we need multiracial movements, but why we also need Black liberation movements, and why those movements need to be in relationship and in coordination. And they also need to be resourced and invested in equally. So, you know, when you look at the history of domestic work, for example, right? Domestic work is rooted in the legacy of slavery. And you know, this used to be work that was predominantly done by Black women, and Black women who were enslaved. And so when you look at the conditions of domestic work, and domestic work sometimes is a term people don't understand. So domestic work is literally work inside the home. It's work that is, you know, helping to take care of a family, helping to take care of children, helping to maintain a household, helping to support and care for aging loved ones, right? Or helping to support the independence of people with disabilities. These are folks who work inside the home to add additional capacity, right, to a family. And, you know, that work used to be, as I said, Black women's work. And the conditions of the industry today are very much shaped by the conditions that that shaped the industry under slavery, right? You know, low pay, low wages, no contract or agreements, no benefits, no sick days off, right? No time with your family, very loose rules or any rules at all. And, you know, I will say that we see those same conditions today, right? And if we weren't investing in undoing the vestiges of dynamics that come out under slavery and were directed towards Black people, right? Then we don't actually have a shot at changing the conditions that exist in the industry today. I can tell you that most domestic workers, right, are not covered under many federal labor protections. Same thing with agricultural workers. And the reason is because there was a racist compromise that excluded agricultural workers, excluded domestic workers who were largely Black and brown from access to the things that most workers have access to now. Those exclusions, the racist exclusions, continue today, right? And so if we're not dealing with the unique conditions under which our communities are attacked, the unique conditions under which our communities are disenfranchised, then we don't give ourselves enough leeway around the potential of what we can build. And having been an organizer in multiracial movements for a long time, I can tell you, I often feel alone and isolated in those movements because Black folks, while there may be smatterings of us, right, there aren't really legions of us in multiracial movements. And I've always asked myself, well, why is that? And one of the answers that I've come to is that sometimes what we do in an attempt to build multiracial coalition or alliance is we try to flatten everybody's experiences as the same. And they're not the same. We can walk around until we're blue in the face and say we're all human, but the fact of the matter is some of us are able to access humanity in a very different way than others. And if our movements can't address that, we can't hope to bring people to them, right? So you just have to be honest about that. But also, I believe that we need multiracial movements in this country to win. And what I'm seeing across the nation is like making my heart lift and sing every single day, because it's not just Black folks out there in these streets. There's a lot of white folks. There's a lot of folks who are Latinx. There are a lot of folks who are identified from the Asian diaspora, and on, right? And I want us to strengthen that, right? And then I remember too that part of what it means to strengthen multiracial movements is to make sure that all of us have the infrastructure that we need to be able to fight back. And one of the consequences after the last period of civil rights, and certainly with the period of Black power, is that our community power infrastructure was intentionally decimated, in part by a government that was really intent on dismantling a very successful Black power movement that was also getting energy and excitement and participation multiracially, right? There's Asian folks who will tell you I was a part of the Panthers, right? There's white folks that will tell you I was down with the Panthers. We have government-sponsored programs that were intentionally designed to dismantle that level of unity. And while they did it, they also dismantled the infrastructure that Black communities had built to be powerful. And so we can't, as Black folks, actually contribute to a multiracial movement if we ourselves are not organized, if we ourselves have not built the kind of infrastructure that we need, not just for ourselves, but to be able to contribute to the larger project of structural change. And so for me, I fundamentally believe that there is a science to building multiracial movements, and some of it is about understanding how anti-Blackness functions within those movements. Some of it is about being careful about trying to flatten everyone into sameness rather than examining differences and how those differences are actually strategic to the project that we're trying to dismantle. And really how those movements can create a new model for how we see each other in our wholeness. Multiracial movements cannot be colorblind, right? We cannot do that thing where we say, well, I don't care if you're blue, green, purple, white, or Black. Well, there are no purple people, as far as I know, no green people, right? But also, I want you to see all of me. I want you to see me and see me the way I want to be seen. And the way I want to be seen is as a beautiful, courageous Black person who loves the skin that I'm in and has done a lot of work to get there. And so rather than saying, I'm standing with you, and by standing with you, I'm not seeing you, tell me that you see me and that you're joined with me and that you're committed to helping other people see me and helping you be seen, right? In the ways that we determine for ourselves. That is the most fundamental component of what it means for us to build movements across difference.
That is really beautiful. All right, I'm going to turn now to some of the questions we're getting from our audience? That's such a great answer to that question, by the way, because I was at a march yesterday, and it was a mix of people, and it was very exciting to see. I found myself excited to see that it was a mix of people who were all chanting together, Black Lives Matter. And I think what you're describing about understanding that so many of the oppressions that we're dealing with in this country are rooted in anti-Blackness. And if you don't deal with anti-Blackness, it's hard to deal with any of these sort of radiating issues. But if you identify that, you actually have a chance.
That's right.
And to see people kind of understanding that finally, sort of, is exciting. Okay, so here's some questions. Let's see here. Oh, well, this is an interesting one. What advice would you have? And you may not have any. Some of these are not questions that you're not necessarily in your, Okay, fine. Okay, what is your response to people, though, and I think this is an interesting question, who have police in their family, or even who are police themselves? Like, is there something you would say now? And another listener talked about the kneeling that some police are doing at events, and some people finding that to be a little bit almost like a strange sort of reenactment of the thing that we're protesting, and maybe, and of course happening with a very small number of policemen anyway. But anyway, what do you think about, like, is there a redemptive, move that a policeman or a woman can
Yeah. Yes, I know. Chris, as you were asking that question, I was actually thinking about, how lots of Black people have police in our families. And, the experience of policing and being in relationship to police, I think is really fascinating. I hear this from white folks a lot, like, well, what if my uncle's a police officer, my dad, my generations of my family have been police officers. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. And I'm just harking back to the notion that for Black folks, we've actually dealt with this tension for a long time.
Right.
We have law enforcement in our families, and even they know, right? Even the members of law enforcement in Black families know, yes, there is a problem here. Right. And different people have different ways of making sense of it. But I don't think that this is such a contradiction. And I think that when it rises to the level of becoming a contradiction is when we defend the profession and the role that it plays, because our relationship is so deep to the person in the profession. We need to be very clear that when we say defund police, we don't mean your dad doesn't matter, right? But it's to say that policing is a profession. It's not. It's a profession. And when I hear things like Blue Lives Matter, I like cringe, because I'm like, look, that's something that you choose to do, right? Being Black is a way that we're born. And so they're already starting from very different fundamental places. But let me also say this, and people might be surprised to hear me say this, but again, I have been in this game for a long time, and I will tell you, when you talk to law enforcement and you really have a conversation, like not a conversation that's like, do you hate the police or do you love the police? But like a conversation about what it's like to do the job. Lots of people will tell you, I got into this profession because I wanted to help people. I have met very few people who are in law enforcement who said, well, I got into this profession because I really want to mess people up. People come into it because we've learned that police are protagonists in our community, and we've learned that police are a way to solve problems. And people come to the profession because they want to be a part of solving problems that they see in their communities. They want to be a part of protecting people and making people feel safe against threats that they may perceive in their community. But here's something that happens. Most of the time, when I talk to people in law enforcement, they say, I got into the profession because I wanted to help. And then I quickly began to get frustrated at my lack of ability to do so. That actually I'm getting called to a domestic violence situation, and you know, knowing that as I take away one person, I'm also impacting a family that has no resources to rebuild,
Right.
actually doesn't make me feel like a hero. When I see somebody on the street who's having a mental health crisis, and knowing that there's no shelter to bring them to, there's no program to bring them to, and the only place I can take them is jail, but that's probably the worst possible place for them, it really erodes that sense of effectiveness and kind of entrenches a sense of battle, right? I'm fighting a war. And that
Right.
shifts people's perception of the role that they're playing in a community. Most law enforcement officers that I have talked to will tell you, I wish that those things were not my role. I wish that, you know, we were able to address the needs that people actually have. And frankly, I don't think police should do that. And people will talk about law and they will talk about order. And it's very complicated, but I wonder, right, if there's also a place for connection there. Now, I am somebody who fundamentally believes that policing is not the way to solve problems. And that doesn't mean that I don't like your grandpa or your uncle or your mama. And I've got law enforcement members in my family too, like many Black people do. And even my family members, you know, understand as well what I'm saying and what we're doing across this country. They also want to see the profession get better. And I don't know if there is ever going to be an alignment there, because there is such deep hurt and pain. I know lots of people who do the work to bring that alignment together, and they are God's people. Honestly, it is hard to do systems change work.
Yeah.
And with that being said, you know, with these, the solidarity shows that you talked about, I want something more. I want something more. I think that we deserve more than police taking a knee. I really do. And I heard that, you know, in some cities yesterday, there were police taking a knee, and then, you know, an hour later they were arresting people and you know, shooting people with rubber bullets. And this constant dissonance is part of why the trauma continues. And it's not that the people behind the shields are good people or bad people. That's not the point. The point is that their job, right, is to control and to contain. And now we're also giving them the responsibility of solving problems that they cannot solve. And that is always going to create the kind of situation where there's a powder keg and a match that's waiting to be lit. And so I'm for symbolism, but I'm also for substance. And I would just compare folks taking a knee to, you know, the thing that the police union had said 2 days ago in Minneapolis, where he said, I've been involved in 3 murders and I never lost sleep over any of them, right? So I think one really important way to get involved, if it's law enforcement, right, is to curtail the scope and scale of the unions. I know in my city, our police union and the leader of the police union in particular is a constant source of racist diatribe and dialogue in response to deep grief, hurt, loss, and pain. And as long as we have that dynamic, it will only land as symbolic when police take a knee, right? I got asked literally last weekend, because there was all this hoopla about who was joining the protests and all the chaos in the protests. And suddenly I'm being asked, should we be telling protesters to work with police to identify bad protesters? And I'm like, hey, we've lost focus here. No, right? No, what we need to be talking about is, how do we keep from getting to a place where people have to take the streets in a global public health pandemic just to assert that our lives matter. That is the most important thing for us to address in this moment. All of the other like symbols and shows are just going to remain those unless we get to the deep core of what is putting America in so much anguish right now.
Yeah, it's a good answer. And I think it's a fair one, you know, like these are all people who are part of the community. But yes, I'm sorry.
That's that problem. I hear you now.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Good. Okay, one last question. And this is from an audience member, and I think this is not something we wanted to talk a lot about tonight, but I think it's a very relevant thing. We are in the middle of a global health pandemic, and also this, you know, period of isolation, which has been a cause of lots of depression and economic dislocation, which we know, and near depression conditions and job loss. And now this. And how are you, for instance, like taking care of yourself within this?
Yeah. I'll tell you, my self-care this week has not been great, but that's how this goes, right? In terms of the pandemic, I mean, from the beginning of March all the way up until a week ago, I was riding my bike 4 times a week, 45 minutes a day, religiously. And that was my way of moving through the stress and anxiety of what it means to be told that not only do you need to stay home, but like you need to limit or not be in contact with people outside your home, which takes a toll on you because, again, remember, connection is at the heart of everything. And then a week ago, you know, all kinds of stuff broke loose. And frankly, my days over the last week have been 13 hours straight on the telephone in meetings, trying to get people to do things or trying to get people to stop doing things. I'm giving advice to people about what they can do right now, even though, you know, there's so much stuff out there. And trying to make sure that I'm drinking water and that I eat more than one thing a day. So on Monday, I was doing awful. I was crispy, as I say, right? Meaning I was just like, don't mess with me today. And then I watched the president tear gas people to take a photo with a Bible upside down at a church he's never attended. And the symbolism, but also the substance of the symbol literally broke me. I mean, as if it's not enough to be dealing with a public health crisis and the ongoing slaughter of Black people, this country is now sliding into fascism in a way that terrifies me. And I don't use that word or phrase lightly. But then I started to see people to continue to resist and for that resistance to grow. And that makes me feel like we really are the majority. We really are the majority. Our values are majoritarian values, and we can win. We can win. So that's where I'm at now. And that's actually what's taking care of me, is like seeing the progress, allowing myself to see what's changing, what victories are happening, and also letting people take care of me. So my partner makes sure that I stick food in my mouth in between sentences on conference calls, and that my water glass is always filled, and that I get to rant and rave for like a good hour after I shut everything down. And then I just get to be quiet, and it's really glorious. So that is how I'm caring for myself right now.
All right. Well, that's a really wonderful way to end. Take care of yourself by watching us maybe win a little bit. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you so much, Alicia. I could have talked to you for another 2 hours. Barely got into my questions. It's okay. We'll do this again sometime. But thank you so much, and get some water.
Bye.
All right. Thank you, everyone.